Okay, good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday night, so it's another halacha and Tanya. Last time we were speaking a very practical din of what's called, as we said, the language then not bar not, which means nice and tam by nice and tam. So discussing just without just to get into the practical things of it. If somebody made a cake in a meat oven that's clean, but was used that day, the custom is you do not eat it directly with milk. You could eat it right before milk, you could eat it right after milk. If the oven was not used for 24 hours and the oven is clean and not used for 24 hours, then the halacha is you can have it together with milk. Okay, remember we discussed it at great length last week. So it is not only relevant to that. If you made macaroni in a halachic utensil that wasn't used for 24 hours, and now you want to mix cheese into the macaroni, so then you have to take it out of the meat pot, obviously, and then you could put cheese into the macaroni because the macaroni is not really halachic because it wasn't used for 24 hours. Okay? If somebody by mistake took macaroni that was cooked in a pot that was used within the last 24 hours, okay, and by mistake they put cheese into it, you could eat it, it's fine. Just l'chatchila we're machmer, that's what halacha says, like Rashi's opinion, that if it was used within 24 hours, obviously, again, this is all if it's clean. If it's used within 24 hours, then we're machmer not to eat it directly with cheese or milchiks. You could eat it right before or right after. Okay, that's the way we were discussing last week. So therefore, we're discussing that if you want to bake a cake on Shabbos, on Friday, for your coffee Shabbos morning, you should try to bake it before you bake chicken in the oven. Because then once you bake chicken in the oven, unless the chicken is completely sealed, closed. But otherwise, you're not going to be able to eat the cake directly with your milk. You're going to have to eat it before or after. That's the halacha that we're learning at great length last week, which in all the various different scenarios. Now, what happens in continuing in the same halachas? What happens if somebody cooks eggs, vegetables, fish in a milchic pot? Okay. You bake. Now, again, until now, we were talking about eating it together with meat or milk, whatever the opposite of what you do. What happens if somebody cooked vegetables in a milk pot? They are allowed to take the vegetables from the meat pot hot and put it into a dairy dish or a dairy pot. What you're not allowed to do, halacha says, which is very serious, you cannot pour from the dairy pot, pour it into the meat pot. That you should not do. And it's, that's a big problem. That's halachically a very big problem. But you could take out the vegetables, the fish that was cooked in a halachic pot, and with, let's say, everything, whatever, take it out and put it, even though it's hot, you could put it into a dairy pot. You could put it onto a dairy plate. As long as you don't pour directly from the meat pot or plate onto the dairy plate or vice versa. Okay? So that's a din that you have to keep in mind. Let's say you cooked macaroni in a meat pot. You cannot pour, and now you want to put it into a dairy pot or dairy plate. You cannot pour from the pot directly into the dairy pot, but you could take out the stuff from the meat pot and put it directly on a hot plate, even though it's dairy. Okay, now one more very slight detail of this, which is not common. What happened if somebody cooked meat in a pot in liquid? And then they took out the meat, but the water is still there. That was cooked with the meat. That meat that water is completely meat, completely fleishik. You cannot put anything milchik on in that cooked food because the cooked food was cooked in a meat pot with water that meat cooked in it. So that water is mamish like meat. So therefore, that food that you cook, let's say you're cooking meat, you took the meat and there was liquid. Yeah, you took the meat out and now you put in vegetables. That vegetables are completely meat. You cannot eat it. And if not only that, if you eat it, you have to wait 6 hours. You have to wait 6 hours because the fact that the meat was cooked in the water, that water becomes like the meat itself. I'll tell you where this is practical. Again, we mentioned this in the past in these dinim, but it's a very practical thing you need to realize. If you order French fries from a meat restaurant, now French fries normally are parrot. There's no meat in French fries. What happens? You order French fries in a fleishik restaurant. Unless if you know differently, those French fries are fleishik. Now, you have to find out you need to find out from the restaurant, do they use the same oil to fry schnitzel? And sometimes they do. If they do, in other words, the restaurant fried schnitzel in oil. And then they take out the schnitzel. Now they fry French fries in that oil. Those French fries are 100% fleishik, 100% meat. Those French fries, you need to wait 6 hours after you eat them before you can eat any dairy. And those are the same thing in a milchik restaurant, except you don't have to wait 6 hours. If you order French fries in a pizza store, so if they tell you they have a completely separate fryer for parve, and they never, ever, ever put meat in it, or meat or dairy, whatever, depending on what you're talking about. So then it's not a problem. But if they don't have a separate fryer for parve, if the restaurant is fleishik, you have to assume it's mamish fleishik. If the restaurant is dairy, you have to assume it's mamish dairy. Okay. Now let's continue with these dinim. Somebody asked a question about making garlic bread. Okay, we're going to get to these dinim right now. So let's wait a while with that din. This din that we learned, called not by not, okay, does not apply if the food was sharp. Meaning, if somebody cooked, again, vinegar, salty water, a lot salty water, onions, radishes, horseradish, herring, pickles, things that are very, very sharp. If somebody cooked in an empty pot, okay, they cooked in a clean, empty meat pot. They put in a bunch of garlics without oil, without too much oil, without any liquids. And they cook the garlics in a meat pot. Even if it wasn't used for 24 hours, those garlics are fleishik. You don't have to wait 6 hours. But those garlics cannot be eaten with milk. Normally, if the pot wasn't used for 24 hours and you cook vegetables in the pot, the vegetables could be eaten together with milk. But because it's sharp, remember we already learned, not only does it unblemish the blemish, it makes the taste even better. Which means when I cook vegetables in a pot, regular vegetable in a pot, the taste that comes into the vegetables is very, very limited taste. But if it's sharp, it makes the taste of the absorption even stronger. So therefore, those garlics are considered mamish fleishik. You don't have to wait 6 hours, but you cannot eat them with milk. The same thing applies to any of the other sharp things that we said. Any of those things, it's tam l'shvach, it's called a pleasant taste, and you cannot eat it with milk or meat, whatever the opposite is. Now, that only applies if you cooked it without liquid, or it's the majority of the food. Let me give you an example. If somebody wants to cook an onion in a pot, and they fill up the pot with a lot of water, a substantial amount of water, and then they cook the onion in that water. Even though the onion is sharp, but it's not sharp anymore. The water diluted it, that it's not halachically called sharp anymore. Or he put in, let's say somebody put, I'll give you an example. Somebody put garlic powder into a part of a food that they cooked in the meat oven. Now, garlic is sharp, but the majority of the food is not garlic. Garlic was only there to give some flavor to the food. So even though you cook garlic together with the vegetables, let's say, the garlic doesn't have a din of a sharp food anymore.
If there's water or none.
Even if there's no water, the fact that you cook, let's say I'm going to make a crazy example. The ladies shouldn't laugh at me if it makes sense or not. You want to cook fish in a meat pot, yeah, and you put garlic on the fish. You're baking it, okay, and you put garlic on the fish, and then you bake it without liquid. You bake it in a meat oven. That garlic is not sharp. It's only sharp if it's by itself, or it's the majority of the food. In other words, if I cook an onion in a pot by itself, okay, a bacon oven, so there's a bacon onion and there's no liquid. That onion, because it's sharp and it's baked in a meat pot, that onion becomes meat. You cannot put cheese on it. You cannot put anything dairy on it. But if there's liquid in there, or it's made as a spice, it's not the main amount of the food, the main quantity of the food, so then it does not have a din of a sharp food. It has a din like a regular food, and then if it wasn't used for 24 hours, you could put cheese on it. Okay, that's a very practical din, because a lot of times people are under the impression that sharp foods are sharp foods always. No, sharp foods have a din of sharp foods when they're either cooked by themselves or they're the majority of the food. Let's say you're going to cook a bunch of garlic together with vegetables, but there's more garlic than vegetables. Then every part of that garlic and vegetables in a fleishik pot is fleishik. So you can't take out a vegetable and put it there with cheese. Okay, but again, the din of chorif, by the way, is a din of only when it's by itself or the majority of the food. But if it's there just to give a taste, you put garlic on the fish, that doesn't make the fish a sharp food. And therefore, if it's not used for 24 hours, you'd be able to cheese on it or whatever. Okay, next. Okay. Next, we're just going to go to some practical dinim. Okay. All the dinim we learned until now basically deals with heat, or what we said, kavush, If you soak it for 24 hours, then it has a din as if it was cooked. Okay, now let's go to cold things. Cold meat that touched cold cheese. Cold meat touched cold cheese. If they're completely dry, both of them, you could just eat them separately and you don't even have to wash it off.
What do you mean by touches?
They're mamish touchy. You have a piece of meat. Let's see, a block of meat and a block of cheese, and they're touching each other in the fridge.
Both unwrapped.
Both unwrapped, obviously unwrapped. If it's wrapped, it's wrapped. But then let's say you have meat that's not wrapped in the fridge. And now you have cheese that's not wrapped in the fridge. And they're touching each other. If they're dry, you don't have to do anything to either of them. You can just eat it. Now, what happens if they're wet? And I'll explain the logic of this in a minute. What happens if they're both wet? And by the way, not both. Either one is wet. Then you have to rinse them off the minigus 3 times. It says in halacha the minigus they wash it off 3 times. It's kosher, but the fact that they were wet and touching each other, that makes it some type of, it doesn't get absorbed in it. You just wash it off 3 times. And they're both fine. There's a halacha. Okay, we mentioned it a long time ago in these halachas, but again, somebody asked me today a question that will explain this thing. Things absorb one from the nether only through liquid. If somebody puts down a hot meat pot on a dairy fire, and they're all dry and they're clean, there's no problem with it. If somebody puts down, and this question comes up a lot, somebody by mistake, I had 2 questions like that just today. People put, by mistake, they took a hot meat pot, and by mistake, they put it down on the dairy table, on the dairy counter. What's the din? There's a hot pot with meat in it, by mistake, put down on the dairy counter.
Is it a clean dairy counter?
I'm talking about, so what's the halacha? If the counter is clean, obviously, because if it's dirty, you got a problem. If the counter is clean and the counter is dry and the bottom of the pot is dry, there's no problem. If you have a meat pot and a dairy pot touching each other with hot meat and hot milk in it, I'm not saying you should do this, but I'm saying after the fact. You have a hot pot of meat, a hot pot of milk, and they're touching each other from the outside, but they're both dry on the outside. The pot is dry on the outside. Understood the pot. The pots are dried on the outside. The din is it's kosher. I mean, you don't make a habit of doing it, because if they be wet, it'd be a big problem. Because something does not become absorbed into something else without liquid. So therefore, if you have dry meat and dry cheese, what do you need to see my picture for? You hear me? You hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah, just to know.
Yes, we hear
You don't
you.
hear me.
Yes, but you're frozen in the picture.
You hear me? My picture is frozen. So is it a good pose at least?
Now it's
What do you
black.
want me to do? I don't want to go out of it and come back in, because then it'll be a whole mishmash.
So it's like a
Who knows what to
podcast.
do, Tom? What?
It's like a podcast right now.
Now it's black.
It's black.
Black is beautiful. Okay, so you won't.
It's like a podcast.
Does anybody know anything about unblack it or unfreeze it? I understand.
It's
We're
something
already
with the
able to
internet.
undo it.
If you turn off your video for
No scholars,
a few
Zoom
seconds,
scholars.
if you turn off your video for a few seconds,
Okay, that's very
you-
good. Now
you
tell me
might
how
catch
to
up.
do that. I don't know
there
how
should
to
be some
turn off my
icons
video.
along the bottom. There's an icon
It
of a
says stop
microphone
video?
and a microphone and a video camera. And if you click the video camera, it'll cross it out and
Yeah.
your video will go off.
Okay, now put it back on.
Yes, and then if you put it back on, it might have caught up and
Is it good now?
Yes, we see you. We see you.
I don't see you, Rabbi. This is Nahama.
I froze.
Okay, it's all right. I can hear. No problem.
Nothing to see. Okay, let's go. Fine. You don't hear me in Israel, what can I do? Get the, I don't run the Israeli government. You
I
don't
can't
hear
hear you,
me in Israel. You hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but I can't see
Shake
you.
your head. You can't see me?
No.
Okay, take a picture of me and hang it up there. Okay, let's go. So if things are dry, okay, if things are dry, then they don't go from one to the next. Okay? So therefore, the same thing when cold meat is touching cold cheese and they're dry, there's nothing causing the meat and the cheese to go into each other. When they're wet, so the moisture causes some type, so because it's cold, it doesn't absorb. So therefore you have to rinse it off 3 times the minig is, and if you did it once, it's also good, but the minig is to wash it 3 times, because then it's good. Now, what happens if one of them is fatty, not liquidy, but fatty, like meat is fatty, so then you have to wash it very, very, very well, because the fattiness also helps in the absorption. Now, what happens if you take a dairy knife, cold dairy knife, and you cut a old piece of meat? Okay? You have a piece of meat, you take a dairy knife, clean dairy knife, and you cut, by mistake, you cut the piece of meat. So the din is, but it's all cold. If it be hot, then we learn that you have a lot of problems. But if it's cold meat, and you take a cold knife and you cut meat with a dairy knife, it says whether the knife was used within 24 hours or not, it doesn't matter. What do you need to do? You need to wash the meat.
I cannot hear you, Rabbi.
Rabbi, I can't hear you.
Can't hear, California.
Can't hear.
Can't hear in Israel.
Okay, I wasn't. You hear?
No.
Yes, we hear. Now I hear you and
That's
see you.
Israel's problem. Get a new
Yes.
prime minister. Okay. Okay, wow, what a miracle. Now, that's not what, so if there be, now it says my internet connection is unstable. Okay, because they're wet, I'm sorry, going back to the knife. When you take a dairy knife and you cut a piece of meat, even though the knife wasn't used for 24 hours and it's cold, there's something called in halacha duchka de sakina. Duchka de sakina means the pressure of the knife. Therefore, because you're cutting with pressure, it's not soft meat. It's not like soft cheese or soft meat. To cut it, some of the meat goes into the knife, some of the knife goes into the meat. And therefore, what you need to do is
Just that little piece of it that we touched.
what did she say? To leave your video off, it may improve audio quality since your internet is limited. Okay, I'm not doing that yet. Okay. So now, because there's pressure of the knife, so therefore you have to wash it very, very well. Plus, cut a thin piece, like the shell, the peel, cut off from the place where the knife cut. And then it's okay. If now, what do you do with the knife? Because there was pressure. Now, if I take a meat spoon and eat some cottage cheese with it, it's cold, there's no problem. I rinse it off in cold water, it's fine. Even though the knife is cold and the meat is cold, but the fact that I'm putting pressure in cutting the meat with the knife, so the pressure causes some meat to go into the knife and some of the knife to go into the meat, even though it's not used for 24 hours. So therefore, you need to rinse it off well and do what's called cut a little bit off. The knife, what do you do with the knife? So the knife, you have to stick into the hard ground for 10 times. You find a hard piece of ground, not after a rain, and you stick it in 10 different places. What does that do? It undoes the pressure of cutting the meat that made the meat go into the knife. That time, 10 times in the ground, is undoing it. It's taking the meat that was absorbed in the dairy knife, it makes it go out of it. And that's what you have to do with the knife. You don't have to kosher the knife because it's all cold, but that's what you need to do. Okay, we'll leave it here. We'll go to Tanya. 10 times, because that's what halacha says, takes it out.